Welcome to the final part of our heritage talk on the Berlin Airlift 10 tons for Tempelhof.
Here's a Schultz cartoon. Every day there was a magazine. Well, it was basically an airlift news promoted, or printed, I should say, which is just two sides of A4 with what was going on in the airlift, given to all the ground crews. Now, there's a reason for that. First of all, each one of them had one of these cartoons in, or usually had a cartoon in from the American cartoonist here. As you can see, it's a Texan aircraft. But also it had all the facts and figures from all the other stations and all the crews. And it was encouraged, as I said before, it was there to encourage competition. It came to a point where a German crew could unload, and we saw that on the film, and unload 8 to 10 tons of coal in the space of 3.5 minutes. Now that is going some, and that is how the lift worked. It worked on the fact that a pack of 30 aircraft may fly from Frankfurt carrying coal to Gatow with 1.5 minutes space between one and the other. And as they would land, it would be descended on and defueled, emptied, and the next one then descended by the next crew and the next crew and the next crew. But because they were all carrying exactly the same stuff, all the same trucks could be used and all the same handling techniques could be used. And then to another airfield, they might fly in flour, and the same process would work. If you mixed up these loads, they certainly didn't. It was difficult to manage how much time the aircraft spent on the ground. So the airlift news was basically a way of banging the drum, if you like, to keep the beat going. I shouldn't forget Winterbottom's efforts as well. As you can see, here is a reference to unloading aircraft really quickly, where the crew have also taken the captain and shoved him in a bag and taken him as well. This I felt was an interesting picture to show. So that's John Hart. When I was researching this project, John was a mine of information, and this is my favourite picture of him. Here he is as a young man, 18, as a leading aircraftsman, out on the lift as one of the engineers, with a bit of time off. And as you can see, the first thing they do is they pop on a German helmet and find a swastika to sit next to. The amount of photographs there are like this that veterans took are fantastic, because it just shows how things have changed, I think. Because there he is smiling away, he's lambasting what's gone on before, but he's there blockaded in the city with those Berliners, helping to keep them alive. Now, that wouldn't have happened 4 years previously. Do you see what I'm getting at? So the point to make is that here is someone's personal recollections, and it was Der Huckelbluster, I think he called it under the picture. But here is a picture of John with his, whilst he was on tour, and John is still around today. A fantastic bloke. So there, it is within living memory, this, but I just felt that this picture just typifies what's going on. So there was time, it wasn't all go, go, go. There was time for rest as well. So in May, tonnage was such that the Soviets had decided that really the blockade wasn't working for them. They hadn't been able to stop aircraft traveling in or flying in. They hadn't stopped aircraft moving out. They hadn't stopped the movement of medicines, people, supplies, or anything really. And they were looking fairly bad. That was the bottom line. The appearances of such was that now that because of the lack of loss of life on this endeavour, it was clear that that the Soviets were just being petty, to put it mildly. And so by May, restrictions were eased on the roads just overnight. There was no real this is going to stop, or or anything like that, as is so often the way with an extremely bad political decision. The best thing to do is give it a good stiff ignoring, and that's what happened here. The restrictions were lifted, and this is here's supplies now going back into the city by road. But the airlift did not stop. and there was a reason for that. The airlift, as it was as plane fare and victuals, continued to supply at the same rate the city, for the simple reason that it needed a stockpile. They needed to finish building the the power station as well, but certainly it needed a stockpile so that if the Soviets imposed a blockade again, it wouldn't be such a big traumatic effort to keep the place ticking over. And here we have some of the tonnage that's involved. You know, quite incredible, really, at the end of the day. But painted on the side of the aircraft, I think it's is it 1.9 or something like that million tons? Basically, what we can say is that, and that's a C-54. What we can say is that by air, we supplied 2.1 million Germans with about a ton of supplies each over a 10-month period, which I feel has got to be hats off, you know, to the crews and everyone else that continued to work at such a flat out pace, really for democracy as it was seen at that time. And so the city then, I wouldn't say is saved, but is certainly restrictions are lifted, roads are unblocked, trains start again, and we end up with the sealed train, if you may remember, backwards and forwards, and all these things run up until the 1990s. So here's the tonnage for you. So we've got, well, you can read the numbers yourself, but the Americans flew in an incredible amount, 1.7, nearly 1.8 million tons. What I think is interesting is the fact that this car is clearly bigger than 6 foot, and what you're seeing here is an aircraft called a packet. Now, the packet could take that as American aircraft. The reason they didn't use some of these big transporters, and the Americans had a thing called a C-74, which could carry about 26 tons. The reason they didn't use those was it was actually more efficient to use the smaller aircraft on such a rapid turnaround than it was to bring in a big monster and have to change it and have to unload it as it stands. So as we can see there, in over, what was it, 277,000 flights, you know, 1.7 million tons brought into Berlin by the Americans. You know, 87,000 flights by us, and over 500,000 tons brought in by us in the lift. This is an incredible amount and an incredible achievement, and a reason, as I've said before, why rationing stayed in the UK until the 1950s. So that's the airlift. I just want to run through a couple of these, just because we're interested in archaeology, aren't we, as well? How does the airlift fit into the Cold War is the question we've got to ask ourselves. Well, historically, it's the first Central European struggle, we should say. It's not the last over Berlin, as you're probably aware. Obviously, with the wall going up, there was one. Various standoffs with tanks at various occasions throughout this city's history as well. But it's to the airlift is a background itself to this nuclear warfare, and it was the Cold War that obviously typifies the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, what we haven't mentioned are the aircraft known as silver plates. So at the same time that the airlift is getting started in 1948, Truman sends over B-29 silver plates, which are a fairly big American bomber, into the UK, to RAF Waddington and Scampton and places like that. Well, they're known as the atomic bombers because the silver plate was modified to take an atomic weapon. Now, we're still debating whether atomic weapons actually came over in 1948 or whether they didn't. But one thing the government did was it made sure that the silver plates was leaked, well, not so much leaked, but was whizzed onto every front page of every newspaper in Britain. Now, you can imagine that soon got across to the Soviets that the atomic bombers had arrived in Britain. Well, that sends a clear message, doesn't it? And I wonder if that was one of the reasons why Stalin's and the Soviets viewpoint was fairly passive throughout the whole of the lift. Don't forget that Stalin himself, the Soviet Union themselves, were only just taking their first faltering steps into the nuclear to the nuclear club, if you like, and so basically that's probably the reason why that was such a passive and look the other way and just ignore it sort of ending to the whole thing. So what does it mean? Right, so let's have a look. So first of all those aircraft that the Americans were using had to be serviced. Oh, there's the silver plates on the bottom left. This is Guy Keddy. Guy Keddy is another serviceman I spoke to on and off whilst researching the book. He went on to work for NASA, became a rocket scientist, and I believe is still going. Here he's at Burton Wood on a day to Blackpool, and this is what the untold side of the Berlin Airlift. So basically, at RAF Burton Wood, all aircraft that needed servicing from the Americans were flown to Burton Wood for their 200-hour checks, and they got those 200-hour checks down to 24 hours. Which was just as quick as loading and unloading at the other end. So they pumped masses and masses of American servicemen back into Britain at a time when most of the RAF stations the Americans had used were closing up. And so the Berlin Airlift reintroduced the American servicemen into Britain and kept him here. Well, not Guy, but kept American servicemen in here to this very day. Some interesting stories appeared, as you can imagine, back to the overpaid business. Warrington, which was a local town to Burton Wood, the magistrates' court suddenly had a big problem with prosecuting prostitution because all the local, the ladies, should we say, from Liverpool used to would travel out to Warrington and frequent all the bars. The Americans. The Americans didn't want a scandal, although there was close to one on a number of occasions. And so the only thing the magistrates were permitted to charge the women with was not prostitution, but the possession of American bedding, whatever that's a euphemism for. So so whenever you see that, if you're researching any history in the courts in that in Warrington area, then that's what it means. But certainly the American serviceman was back, and the American Air Force was back in Britain to stay for the duration of the Cold War. It spawned the Ration Book Olympics. Just the 1948 London Olympics was also a symptom, if you like, or was impacted by the airlift, because all the rations. Britain was still on ration, and all the athletes that came over had to bring their own food. They were all billeted in old army depots and things like that. You can imagine the athletes of today, can't you, with that? But the Olympics went on, and they went on for a reason. They went on to show that people were getting back to normality. Some of you may remember Professor Magnus Pyke, who was a scientist who was famous in the 70s, 80s and 90s for his outlandish way of describing things. Well, Magnus Pyke was the dietitian for this. So he was part of the Ministry of Food. You know, there is masses of paperwork, as you would imagine, in the archive of the, how come some people were eating steak, while other countries were only eating ham, and is this affecting their performance? It's quite interesting. But it's an aim to get back to normality when actually there's anything but normality going on in Europe. In Britain, it spawns the Civil Defence Act. Everyone's familiar with the Warden and other things like that in the Second World War. Well, it was that organisation was stood down in 1945. 1948, it was resurrected, and civil defence as a voluntary organisation ran until 1968. It had a number of facets to it, including the welfare section, as you can see there, with ladies of a certain age handing out tea and soup and things like that. It became an integral part of the British passive defence system. It was abolished, as I say, in 1968, which is a bit of a shame, really, because we may have been able to use parts of it today. The Auxiliary Fire Service came into being at the same time, with arguably one of the most iconic Cold War things ever. Never mind a Vulcan bomber or V-Force and things like that. It's the Green Goddess. This is not a fire engine, it's a pump. I get told off when I say it's a fire engine, but it's a mobile pump on a Bedford chassis. And these were utilised up until the 1990s and kept in storage until about 1994. And some of them are still lurking today, mostly at car shows and things like that. But the bottom line is there's quite a need for to see these, and they're quite an iconic aspect, as you can no doubt agree. Probably the most important, though, was the formation of Nato in April 1949. Nato was an American-sponsored initiative which said that of all the nations that have joined, and there's a series of flags on the right-hand side there that give you an idea of who they were, will work as a protective coalition. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization continues today, and interestingly, has more of an aggressive has had more of an aggressive role in the world since the Cold War, with Yugoslavia and various places such as that. But its initial concept was that an attack on one of the countries there, or a member state, would mean an attack on all. And what this brought billions and billions of American dollars and hardware into Europe, and allowed countries that had smaller defense budgets to operate in certain theaters. So whilst we had a big army footprint in Germany and things like that, we had two roles in NATO. One was the nuclear strike, so the original aspects being the V-Force with the blue steel, but also anti-submarine and anti-shipping with the Nimrod force and such like. So this became a massive coalition against any further Soviet aggression. And a few years later, of course, we end up with the Soviets forming the Warsaw Pact, which is exactly the same. So we end up with two massive blocks stood facing each other down for over 30 years. And that is a key legacy of the Berlin Airlift. So I hope that's been of interest. It's a complex subject to summarise, it has to be said, but I hope you realise that actually there is a start to the Cold War. We don't just trip from one to another. There has to be grumblings, but the Cold War proper really starts with that endeavour. But more importantly, what the Berlin Airlift shows us is that once aggressors can bury the hatchet, and people can become people again after such horror and misery as wrought in the centre of in Central Europe and across the Soviet Union. And whilst we end up with an ideological war of East facing West, the airlift itself really sets the tone for superpower relations, where it's more, in the case of the Americans and the Soviets, certainly, it's more a case of standoff. Cuba is a standoff, various other places are a standoff as well. It's only later that insidiously we end up with the phenomena that the Cold War provides us, which is war by proxy, where Afghanistan is a key example of that, although it becomes quite a hodgepodge of political involvement and then troop involvement and not. But think about South America, think about Africa and places like that. They've suffered at the hands of both East and West, and most of those conflicts are still not settled today. And that is still the tangible effect of what happens in 1948, I believe.
Thank you for watching our heritage talk on the Berlin Airlift, and thank you to Bob Clarke for providing such a detailed account. Keep an eye out for future heritage talks across our social media channels.